A dark and scary world full of crisis and decay, an age of science and technology showing us the way.
Where disease and decay dominate the news, COVID and vaccines leave us confused.
Broken hearts, empty beds, exhausted nurses, endless social media threads.
Have we lost? Have we given in? Do we just let the countless deaths win?
Where is our hope with so much to dread, when all that was normal is turned on its head?
Is there any hope?
Defined as a feeling of desire for something to come, an expectation of goodness, but who knows where from.
Joe Wicks at home PE sessions, Sir Tom Moore's charity lessons, laps around the yard for the NHS working so hard.
Maybe the answer is amongst woman and man, amongst ministers and presidents saying they can provide a safe solution to combat the fear, a lockdown or isolation that lasts all year.
But where do we look for hope beyond death?
There was a man who once lived with a message to share, a man who spoke of God and miracles and prayer.
He said a kingdom has come, it's a message of joy, a hope beyond death, a curse to destroy.
An answer for those who despair, to look to a man who lovingly cares.
He was beaten and killed on a cross of wood. In our place for our sins he stood.
But he conquered the grave and rose to new life, so that we who believe need not live in strife.
Do you see it's an answer for all those who cry, who fear and who hide, and ask this world why?
The King who speaks as a leader of man, who suffered and bled and rose so we can.
Trust in a hope of a life beyond the grave, a place where leaders and rulers don't make us a slave.
He is hope and good news for all those that choose to look at this claim, to trust in his name.
It's up to you to decide to climb the slope, to see that the Lord is our living hope.
Hi everyone, welcome to the last week of Living Hope. We're so glad you've joined us tonight for our talk on Is Being a Good Person Enough? But first we're going to hear from Emily, who's a member of the CU, and she's going to be sharing a bit about her faith and what that means to her.
Hello, my name is Emily and I'm in my third year training to be a primary school teacher. I thought I would talk today a little bit about my testimony and what living hope means to me. So my parents weren't Christians for the beginning part of my life, but when I was 10, my mum met this lady at the gates at primary school, and they started talking, and this lady started telling my mum about Jesus. And my mum felt so touched by this that we decided to try out church for ourselves. So we started going to this very small Methodist church. It was very traditional, and their congregation was mainly over the age of 65, and there weren't any children there. But me and my sister loved the Sunday school and the soup that they'd serve after a service. But then this lady who initially invited my mum to church and to get to know Jesus invited us to her church, which was a big family church. The music was lively, everyone was so welcoming and loving, and it just felt at home to us. So we stayed, and I spent my teenage years going to youth groups and summer camps and Soul Survivor and learning more and more about faith and God and what Jesus had done for me. And it was just a great place to be. When I was 16, I went to Soul Survivor, and I was so overwhelmed by how many young people were just on fire for Jesus. It was just an amazing place to be. But one standout moment in my testimony was when I was 18, just before I was about to sit my A-levels. I became really unwell. What started off as a physical problem became more of a mental health problem, and I was really suffering. But I was very much suffering in silence, and I didn't really tell anyone outside of my immediate family what was going on at the time. But it felt relentless, and it was affecting my day-to-day life, and it felt crippling. And I woke up every day feeling so unwell, and that there was no end or hope in sight. I turned to prayer, but I'd stopped going to church because I couldn't face it at this time. But when I was praying, I did feel like nothing was really happening, and I felt quite lost and abandoned by God at this time. But then about a month later, I got convinced to go to church, and I don't know how I got there because I was still really struggling. And I just didn't want to be there at all. So when I got there, I stayed at the back and I just lingered, and I didn't really want to be seen or for anyone to speak to me. But this man came to the back of the hall during the worship, and he came up to me, and I'd never met this man before and I'd never spoken to him, but he asked if he could pray for me. And at this time, I'd never spoken to the church about what was going on, But this man could tell me what I was struggling with, and he told me that God had told him this, and this man knew what was going on, and God had used him in this way, and it was the most amazing experience. And from that prayer and from that moment, things started to get better. After he prayed for me, I felt so at peace, and I had so much joy, and I have so much freedom now in an issue that I thought would affect me for like my whole life. I've now found so much freedom from that prayer and so much healing. And I learnt through this just how personal God can be, and how crazy it is that like the creator of the world cares so much about you, and so personally and so individually as well. So what Living Hope means to me is that it's a constant hope, that God knows your struggles and worries, and he offers this constant hope and comfort. And even though I felt hopeless when I was poorly, and just when I prayed I didn't really feel like it was going anywhere, that God was actually working behind the scenes. And I just want to encourage you that God loves you, and he's always with you, and he's for you, and even though you may not always see it. When I was having a look at my testimony, thinking about it, a psalm popped out to me, which is Psalm 62 verse 6. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. So I hope that encourages you, that even if you're in this storm, that God is always there.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Emily. We're now going to hear from Leonie, who's a staff worker at Exeter CU. If you have any questions tonight about the CU or Christianity or anything that was spoke about, then in the description box there's a feedback link where you can submit your questions, and someone will be in contact with you straight away.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us this evening. Thanks so much for tuning in to look together at some of the big questions in life. And tonight, the question that we're going to explore is the question, isn't being good enough? Can't we all just simply live our lives, be good people, and let that be enough? Ultimately, I think this is a question about acceptance. What must we do in order to be accepted? Isn't being good enough? Well, it sounds quite straightforward and uncomplicated if you say it like that. But I would like to dig a little deeper into this argument and maybe explore what the Christian faith has to say to this question. So I'd like you to think about it for a second. Are you good enough? Are you a good person? It's quite a tricky question, isn't it? Because how would you even start to define what it means to be morally good? And how good is good enough? I'll start with an easier question, okay? Are you good at running? Are you a good runner? During the first lockdown, some colleagues and myself, we were furloughed. So obviously someone thought it was a great idea to create this group on a running app. They called it Furlough Fitness. And for some reason, I ended up joining this group. Okay. But in the back of my mind, I was a bit worried because I knew that the majority of the people in this group were actually really good at running. And I was worried that they were going to look at my stats and see that I'm not particularly good. I tend to stop running whenever I encounter a hill, right? And most other people, they were in the like 10k to half marathon kind of bracket, some crazy times. And so compared to them, I was a terrible runner. I was definitely not good enough compared to them. But if you compare me to my grandmother, it's a very different story. Because my grandma, even though she's, still quite fit, she doesn't really run anymore. I don't think she's ever run, to be honest. But compared to her, I am actually a great runner. And perhaps you recognise that tendency to compare ourselves to other people to determine how good we are. We measure ourselves against other people constantly. We do it on a personal level, comparing views on TikTok or results on results day. We do it on a collective level, ranking universities. We even do it on a global level. Did you know that the UK is number 13 on the Global Happiness Index compared to all the other countries? We achieve and we compare and we put value on others and ourselves according to what we have achieved. Now, as I was researching this, I came across a new word. and the word that I learnt was meritocracy. And I think it's a really good description of that. In a meritocracy, people are selected and ranked and rewarded according to merit, according to what they have achieved. So just like a ladder, the higher up the ladder you are, the more you will be rewarded. And we're so constantly caught up in comparing ourselves that I think it's the same case for the question, isn't being good enough? Am I good enough? Well, it depends on who you compare me to, right? And so we put ourselves on this ladder, a ladder of moral goodness, and we place ourselves on it compared to other people. And we're constantly climbing, trying to get higher, trying to be better than other people. And somewhere along this ladder, there should be a line that says enough. And if we reach that line, well, then we are good enough. I don't know if you've watched any of the serial killer documentaries on Netflix, like Making a Murderer or the Ted Bundy tapes. I think part of the reason for why we love watching these crime documentaries is because it reminds us, compared to other people, we are quite good. Comparing ourselves to the worst of people, we're able to conclude, yeah, I am good enough. There are people out there that are better than me, sure. But there were also a lot of people who were a lot worse than me. And we expect other people and our society, the universe, and maybe even God to reward us for, being good enough. We expect to be accepted on the basis of our ladder. The approach that, helps us to say that, yeah, we are good enough. Now, there are a number of problems with this meritocracy that we have created. And I think we've all encountered this. We could always be better. I don't think any of us actually want to live in a meritocracy because we know we're not the very best. And so the problem with the ladder approach is it's just the stress and the uncertainty of it. By measuring ourselves in comparison to other people, we end up either crushing other people to feel better about ourselves, or we can also crush ourselves under standards that we constantly fail to meet, constantly telling ourselves that we're not good enough, that we need to do better. So we're on this ladder and we're working and we're climbing and we're looking up and down to other people to see if we measure up. So here's a question for you just to think about for a moment. What do you do to make yourself more acceptable? Like, we live in a world where we're constantly trying to earn likes and retweets and pats on the back and medals. And we're constantly trying to earn approval. And we can ask ourselves the question, at the end of the day, was that good enough? Now, I'm a Christian, and you might have a certain idea of what Christianity is about. Well, surely it is about being good, about earning your way to heaven, about doing certain actions and following certain rules to make us acceptable to God. Well, Jesus himself explains it best when he tells a really interesting story about what it means to be good enough. And it's not quite how we would expect. It's a story about two people who approach God for worship. And you can find this in one of the biographies that is written about Jesus' life. It's written by a bloke called Luke, and he wrote this as an eyewitness to Jesus' life. And in his 18th chapter of his biography, we can read this story about these two people. And Luke comments that this story is specifically told to those who were confident of their own righteousness. People who were confident that they were far enough up this ladder to be accepted by God. So here we have two men going to pray in this story. One is a Pharisee and one is a tax collector. Now, a Pharisee is a religious leader in the Jewish society of the time, and he goes to the temple to pray. And he prays, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, even like that tax collector over there. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all that I have. This man is the perfect example of someone who thinks according to the ladder approach. He does a bunch of good stuff, and then he compares himself to other people who aren't as good as him. Author Mark Twain used to talk about people who are good in the worst kind of sense, and I think this is exactly the type of person that he talked about. This is how many people live their lives, maybe particularly religious people. Isn't that the point of religion? Trying to do certain things, keep certain rules in order to be accepted by some deity. You've got the Buddhist Eightfold Path, the Hindu doctrine of karma, the 5 pillars of Islam, and each of these offers a way of life, a roadmap, if you want, to approval. And it can be quite tempting to think that way, right? I would love to be responsible for my own destiny, and I tell myself I could be good enough. And this Pharisee seems to have done pretty well for himself. He's not a robber, he hasn't cheated on his wife, he's not a serial killer whose documentary ends up on Netflix. So, he sounds like he is good enough. And when we look at ourselves, we might initially think we are doing pretty well. But then when I'm honest with myself, I could also do better. And especially when I look at the standard that Jesus sets for his followers, I fall painfully short. If you do go and read one of the biographies about Jesus' life in the Bible, you can see how Jesus asks his followers to give all their possessions away, to love the people that hate you. He says that things like lust and anger are as bad as cheating or actually murdering someone. Jesus doesn't give a clear-cut list of achievable rules that we can just check off to get us into heaven. His demands are frankly impossible. To forgive other people all the time, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, is slightly unrealistic. You see, when God created human beings at the start of the story, he created human beings in his own image. And we are supposed to reflect and carry the image of the one who is the essence of goodness, of love and of justice. And this is where our inherent value comes from. Not from actions or achievements, but from the fact that we are loved and created by God himself. And when God creates humankind, he says, it's very good. He calls us very good. And he asks us to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, to reflect his image. Well, we only have to look at our reflection in the mirror to realise that this is no longer the case. Our human nature is broken, it's spoilt. We turned away from him who is the ultimate good one to decide for ourselves what we think is good. And no matter how hard we try, as a result of this rebellion, we fall short of his standards, of the ultimate good, of the best that we were supposed to be. And so the God of the Bible is not interested in accepting the good people and then excluding the bad people, for the very reason that no one is good enough. Everyone falls short. Okay, maybe this is time to pause, right? If we all just tried our best, wouldn't that be fine? We know no one is perfect, but, is it really that bad? If we make a mistake or two, maybe God can just look past that and be a bit more understanding and, a bit more lenient. Now, I don't think it works that way. And I actually think that the Christian worldview is the only one that takes evil and brokenness seriously. Even the best person in the world, and maybe that is you, even the best person in the world has to admit that there are things in their lives that they cannot fix simply by being good. There is evil, there is suffering. Yes, we are capable of incredible good, but we are also guilty of incredible evil. And God is not some cold cosmic calculator who can delete bad things if we've been nice for a week. Experience is not convertible in that way. Cruelty cannot be cancelled out by equal amounts of being nice. The hurt and the shame that we carry with us cannot be self-helped away. and I carry with me things that I wish I could change, but I can't. The wrong that I have done has bigger consequences. It devalues other people, and God takes that personally. If God were to ignore that, he would not take our pain and our need for justice seriously. The value that is placed on human beings is infinite. And so the stuff we do to each other has consequences. We are all separated from God because of this. None of us are acceptable to him. It is a bit of a problem. But Jesus offers us a solution. You know, I can be quite a stubborn person at times. I love doing things by myself, proving I'm a strong, independent woman and all that. Sometimes when I'm doing something, it goes wrong and I get really annoyed. But the problem is I refuse to let anyone help me. I'm full of pride and I always get myself into worse trouble before I actually have to give up, throw my hands in the air and acknowledge that, okay, fine, I need help. And I wish that I could fix the world by being good. But the brokenness of this world and the darkness in my own heart are too big and too serious to ignore. We are completely powerless. Now remember Jesus' story about the two men who were praying, right? And there was one who was listing all the things he thought would make him acceptable to God. Well, there was someone else there, the second man, the tax collector. Now, this man wasn't particularly popular at his time, even now, who likes taxes? But this man enters the temple, and Jesus tells us he stood at a distance. He wouldn't even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Hold on, okay, sinner. Isn't that a bit harsh? We don't want to go around calling people sinners, right? But let's stop and think for a second. What is sin? I'm not talking about the chocolate that is sinfully good. When the Bible talks about sin, it talks about those things that separate us from God, those things that make us less than perfect, the things that ruin God's image in us. And as I mentioned before, if we are honest with ourselves, that is all of us. So this man doesn't have a particularly negative self-image, just a very realistic one. Now you see the contrast, the way in which these two men approach God. One is confident of his own achievement, full of pride, looking down at other people. But the second man doesn't even lift his eyes. He doesn't list his deeds. He doesn't compare himself to others. He is brutally honest and confesses his need for mercy. I need help. And Jesus tells us that it was the last man, the tax collector, the sinner, who went home justified and accepted before God. Because this man didn't trust in his own goodness. He believed in God's goodness. Now God is a holy God, and we could never be acceptable to him in our sinful state. But rather than distancing himself from us, rather than refusing us, God came to share in our brokenness because he loves us so much. He came to walk through the brokenness with us. And in Jesus, God himself took the punishment for our wrongdoings by dying on the cross. He took that alienation, the rejection that we deserved, and he rose again to life, opening up a way for us to come to God again. So we can now approach God not based on what we have done, but based on what God has done. So we don't have to be good enough. One of the most influential people in the life of the early church was a guy called Paul, and he wrote a letter to some new Christians, and he said, just at the right time, when we were powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. For the ungodly. Those are the people that God is interested in. Those are the only kind of people that exist, to be honest. The broken, unacceptable ones. So, if we are to take a survey in our society, right, and ask people, what do you have to do to be accepted by God? Most people would probably say, be good. Now, Jesus completely rejects that in this story. What we must do to be accepted by God is to cry for help and receive his grace. Now, grace is not flattering. It means we have to rely not on ourselves, but on God for our ultimate acceptance. Our world is constantly telling us that we are not good enough. In our modern meritocracy, everything depends on our performance. But God does not run a meritocracy. Our acceptance does not depend on our own performance, but on his. And our value lies in the fact that we are created and loved by God, that he died to make us acceptable to him again. And compared to the ladder of achievement, this is incredibly freeing to know that God doesn't require any specific actions. He accepts us because Jesus was good enough. And in knowing him, I can freely try to be the one that he created me to be, often failing, but trying to be a blessing to others around me, to live a life that is acceptable to him, not in order to be accepted, but because I already am accepted. It's a bit like the running app that I told you about at the beginning. You see, I had to request to be part of this group with my colleagues, but they didn't assess my times or my scores to see whether I was good enough. They didn't, thank God, accept me based on any merit or achievement. And they're not going to throw me out if I stop running. Once I was in this group, we encouraged each other. Even the worst runner got a like and a well done, keep going. We all helped each other to become better runners. And I think that's a wonderful image of what it's like to come to Jesus, to follow him. We are accepted into his family, into a right relationship with him. So isn't being good enough? It is not. But friends, there is so much more to life. There is so much more to a life with God than simply trying to be good enough. Why would you try and achieve goodness by yourself when grace is offered freely in Jesus? Why would you settle for just trying to be good enough when you can come to the God who created you, where you are known and loved despite all of your flaws? Now, I'm sure you have a bunch of questions and would love to challenge some of the things that I have said. Why not chat to a Christian friend about the difference that is in their lives as they rely on Jesus for their acceptance? Why not read more of the stories of Jesus to explore whether what he says is really worth listening to? Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a really great evening.
Thank you, Leonie, for speaking to us tonight. As I said before, if you have any questions, then please do send them in. We would also love if you had any feedback about Living Hope or tonight's talk if you sent that in using that same link. Check out our social medias to keep up to date with what the Plymouth Christian Union are up to, and I'll see you on Friday for our next talk on Why God's Way.